looks like we are up and running here. Can I get Yeah, so it's kind of tucked away, but if you just go around this way, it's going to be in the center section of our furniture department. You'll see it all the way in the back wall.
Okay.
Of course. Can I get any of you guys water bottles while we're doing this?
Sure. Thanks, too.
Absolutely.
What does it mean when it says set the lens to the shooting position?
Right now, your lens has a lock on there, so if you look at your lens itself, it has a little dot that it's on right now. That means that it's not in the shooting position. You need to rotate it to get it to that 18. Now it's officially in shooting
It's a good
position.
thing we came. Back alone is worth it. Thank you.
That's the class. That's all I got for you today.
Okay, okay, bye, you go now.
Take care.
Wow. All right, so there's.
All right. Let me get going with this. Hey, welcome in. You want a water bottle?
Sure, why not?
I got you, son.
Hi there.
Did you get the new camera yet?
No.
Oh, come on.
Dad, we're going this summer with this camera. We're going to see how it goes.
All right.
All right, let me get started, everybody. Welcome to intermediate camera class. My name is Saxon. We're going to jump right into it now that we got some people showing up. Today is going to be intermediate camera class, so we're really focusing today on just kind of our main controls for the camera, making sure we understand it fully, and then just kind of diving into situations where you might use them. We'll talk about lenses at the very end of class to really drive everything home. But yeah, without further ado, let's get started. All right. So in last class we talked about the very basics. We went through button layout, we went through SD cards, just understanding that we need those to really function the camera, as well as then just talking a little bit about content creation and just supplies that might be needed. But in this case, I think what we're talking about is why do we get more advanced within our point and shoot, our DSLR, our mirrorless cameras. And really the point of that is to articulate or get, let's say, a better photo than we would if we were to just use our automatic features, or if we were to just use our phone, or if we were just to kind of sloppily just take a picture. To be more advanced with our camera is to be in tune with our camera, is to understand how it functions, what it's doing, and what all those numbers and different speeds and apertures and ISO, what all of that really means when it comes to the grand scheme of getting a good photo. So first thing I show in this one is an example I took not long ago. About 2 years ago, before I started teaching the class, I wanted to do a difference between a snapshot and a photograph. Now, in my mind, a snapshot is a quick picture. It's meant to be something that you're not putting a lot of thought or time or effort into. You're just trying to get a picture of whatever it is. So if you've been to App before, we have 2 escalators that take you up to our 2nd floor bar, our fountain. The escalator on the right side of the fountain, facing north, that is going to take you up towards our mattress department, and we have this really cool mural of Chicago on the ceiling there with clouds in the buildings, and it makes you look like you're rising into the building. So it's a cool little shot there. Having that by itself, just a quick picture, there's nothing too fancy with it. You can see it's an escalator, you can see the color, you got some awkward shadows going on. It's really not necessarily a pretty photo by any means. But by setting my camera up properly, changing aperture, shutter, and ISO on there, I'm able to bring out more color of my image. I'm able to disguise some of the shadows a little bit. I'm able to change the mooding, the light with it as well too. And I'm really able to make sure that I center in and get an even photo that doesn't look wonky or wobbly. So my difference between a photograph and a snapshot is just by setting the camera, being more intentional with what you're trying to do, and just trying to overall utilize the features that your camera has without being so automatic. So again, being in an automatic setting and then switching over to something like full manual when you fully understand what the controls are doing for you and offering.
Is that the same camera that was used to...
Same camera. Just the difference on making sure that you set everything up properly and that you're taking the proper shot. And that's what we're going to talk about for the most part of today. So step 1, first step in all this is to learn your camera. I like this slide because it just kind of iterates how many different cameras are out there. I used this probably about a year ago when I put this slide together. At this point now, Nikon has about 3 more cameras on there. Canon has 2 more in their lineup that weren't there before, and Sony has about 5 additional cameras that have come out since that came out. Learn your camera, use the material that comes with the camera. That book is fantastic. It is really thick if it does come with a user manual, but it'll really help you just understand where the menus all are on the camera, what buttons do what on there, and just your kind of your quick notes navigation to understanding it. It's not necessarily going to solve all your picture making problems, but it should at least get you to understand where everything is located. And if you can't find it, that's where YouTube or myself comes into play. Lightly to go into it a little bit too, we talk more about editing in the next class in advanced photography, but if you're looking at this point now, you feel like you've stepped up since your automatic start and now you're ready to kind of play with things a little bit, you can continue to shoot automatic on your camera, but you might want to look at now some editing software. Even if you are shooting full manual, pictures don't always come out perfect with the color and the saturation that we want it to have. That's where then getting and investing in some of these editors are really nice. You bring out color, you play with background, you manipulate parts of your photos to really bring out the best qualities that you want out of your photo. So Photoshop or the Adobe suites are my personal favorite. You pay monthly for them. That's the only downside. Capture One Pro and the Corel Paint Shop Pro, you pay a one-time fee with them, and they have very similar features to Photoshop and Adobe, but they are their own properties and entities, and they have some differences between them. So definitely look into it if that is something you want to go with, or if that's something you're looking to play with. So before we jump into exactly what aperture, shutter, and ISO is and look at some examples of all that, it's important that we understand the mode dial. I talked about this in the last class when we were going through the buttons for the camera, but the mode dial essentially is your gear shifter for your car. You start with your manual or your automatic transmission, and from there then you have all of your ability to go all over the place, whether that's going up in gear, whether that's shifting to park or to neutral. You have that ability to switch all through your gear shifter, and the mode dial does exactly that. Hi there, welcome in. So in this, the first thing we talk about are automatic, program auto. The next things that we're really going to be focusing on is your aperture priority, your shutter priority, and then full manual control over everything on the camera. That's what we'd like to get to ideally. Now, a lot of people sometimes poo-poo the fact that there's a shutter and an aperture priority. They say that's not truly utilizing the entirety of your camera. I personally love both the aperture and the shutter priority because it gives you control over one feature, and the rest of it the camera's doing itself. And we'll go through examples for what appropriate times to just use one of those priorities might be. To sum the priorities up though, I don't have a slide for it, but automatic we already talked about. So your automatic setting means that the camera's going to do everything for you. All you're doing is pointing the camera, making sure you have your composition the way that you want it to be, and then from there pulling the trigger and taking the photo. When we move to program auto, some things now become available for us to edit and change. Things like our focus parameter, things like our light metering, things like our subject detection, things like our white balance. ISO is changeable on there too. So there's a few different things that we can now change and program on our automatic while still letting the camera maintain its main function of shooting everything based on what the camera sees. Aperture priority gives us priority only over the f-stop of the camera, which we'll go into detail about what that actually controls. Shutter priority is giving us control over the speed at which the shutter is firing and closing. And then full manual is giving us control basically over everything that we have here. Full manual really is amazing when you fully know how to use it and you understand what is being picked up by the camera. So like I said in the beginning class, if you're brand spanking new to cameras and you have no clue what you're doing, automatic and program auto are your best friends. Don't be intimidated by the fact that you're not using full control over your camera. It's a great way to get started, understand what the camera's doing, and then from there learn off of that to get into the other settings on the camera. The main thing we're going to look at in the class for the next couple slides here are going to be the exposure triangle. This is an age-old example that they've had in multiple textbooks. This has been around probably since the 1940s or 30s when film cameras really started to become more prominent and more developed by certain companies. The exposure triangle basically is going to break down your aperture, your shutter, and your ISO. Now what we'll do now is talk about each of them separately, why priority matters, and then how this fits all together in the grand scheme of things. First thing we're going to talk about is aperture. So on any of your camera bodies, if you look at the camera body that you have, there's two options for aperture. Advanced lenses, or let's say more old school lenses, will have an aperture ring on the outside of the lens itself. aperture ring usually starts somewhere between maybe a 1.4, 1.8 being the lowest number on there. As you turn that number, it goes usually up to about a 16 or 22. Now your lens might not necessarily have that low of a number on there. Your lens also might not have any number on there. Depending on the lens that you have, the control for aperture might also come from the different dials that we have on the camera itself. So if you don't have numbers that are clearly written, like 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, possibly 22 as well, then the function for aperture is controlled by the body of the camera instead. And I can show people that if you're looking for it on your camera body itself. So yeah, yours is going to be on the camera itself. It's not going to be on the lens. So for you, aperture control, turn this on. We'll go to our aperture priority mode. That's going to be AV. Now, on the camera, as we take this dial that's on the top there,
Now, what is that dial?
that's going to be for aperture. So as
That thing?
so
Okay.
here, you can see it on the bottom there. As I
Okay.
turn this, the number starts to change.
Okay,
That's giving us control over aperture.
okay.
So some lenses have it where it's built onto the lens itself. Other lenses have it where it's built onto the camera, and you're switching via the dial that's on there. That would be one of the command dials. You guys can have a seat. For anybody who just showed up, would you like a water bottle? No? Would you guys like water bottles?
No, but-
Alright, let me know if you change your mind. I got a fridge right behind. So, aperture control is really going to be the control over your foreground to background separation that we have. The way that aperture works is that when the number is the biggest it can be, depending on your lens that you have, the hole or the iris of the lens is going to be tiny. What that's doing is it's letting in a limited amount of light, but it's giving the photographer the ability to take a picture of both the foreground and the background. In this case, our foreground is going to be where our subject matter is. That's where the little stick figure waving is. And our background is the pyramids. In a case like this, we probably want to get both the foreground and the background to show off that, hey, we're on vacation, we're in front of the pyramids. It's a once-in-a-lifetime picture. But if, let's say, we didn't like the background, maybe it's actually a dumpster that's behind us, but the kids look really nice, you want to get a picture of the family or what have you, we can then go and take our aperture to the lowest setting that we can. The lower the aperture goes, the more we're going to start to blur out the background and have primary focus on the foreground. Where aperture is extremely important is when we get into things like portrait photography, where we don't necessarily care about the background that we have. We're more focused on getting a very highly detailed shot of our subject matter and then getting rid of everything else. So, again, aperture is going to be our control over our foreground and our background separation. The higher the number goes, the smaller the iris of the lens will get. So when you turn your camera on, sometimes you can notice it when it's on and you start turning the number, it'll automatically start to make the hole smaller. Now I have a manual controlled lens on the Leica here, and by turning it, you can kind of see that the center of the lens starts to get big when I go to the small numbers, and then small when I go to my bigger numbers. That's controlling that background to foreground separation that we're getting with the lens. That's what's then going to give us our background blur effect. Some examples that I have with that to kind of drive that more home.
I have a question.
What you got?
My when I like go to the A, that's the A setting, right? The lowest I can get is 4.5.
Yeah, because you've got a kit lens. So some of these lenses, when they are not the best quality or when they're a lower lens type, they're not going to have necessarily that higher aperture that we can get to. So for portraits, the lowest you're going to be able to do is that 4.5.
I can get up to 29.
So you can get something that's really open. So you
Right.
can get a good shot of your background and your foreground. As far as getting to that perfect background blur, you're not going to be able to get that, unfortunately.
No.
Where yours will tap off will probably be around there.
Okay.
Now the problem with those lenses, and we talk about that towards the end too, is that with kit lenses, they have what's called an I forgot what the term is, but I know it's the maximum aperture basically is variable. It's a variable maximum aperture. So when you start to zoom with that lens, that 4.5 is now going to go to a 5.6, and now you're not going to be able to go any lower than 5.6. If you flip the lens to the front, you can actually see it right there. So it tells you the lowest it can go is 3.5 when you're at the 18. So when you're at full 18, you're going to get 3.5, and you can go all the way up to 29.
Okay.
But as you start to zoom in and you get to that
Changes.
55, the smallest you're going to be able to go is 5.6.
Okay, and then this one, right, is
Flip that, take the cap off. Should tell you the same. Down snips are written on the side.
yeah.
So, yep, same thing. 4.5 to 5.6. So that's how you're going to learn what your aperture is. Now, if you're trying to achieve something lower like this, that's where getting higher quality glass comes into it. The better the glass is, usually the wider the glass is, the better the sweet spot of the lens is. And with that being said, then the lens itself has more components to it, where then you can actually blur the background out more successfully. So where that's limited, the only way to get past that would be getting different lenses that then give you that ability.
or do it in Lightroom.
You can. Usually though, once you get to Lightroom with the blur in the background, it doesn't work the way you want it to. Because it doesn't have that. It all starts with the optical of the
Sure,
lens.
okay.
So some examples of this. When we look at aperture, we can look at these photos for example. So on the left side, we have the dog nose. We can clearly see there's another dog in the background. However, it's blurred out to the point where we can make out the shape of the dog, but we don't see the dog in such crispness. So if we compare this to our chart before, we're probably somewhere between F8 or F11, where we can make out the subject matter in the foreground. We can see that. The background itself is clear, but it's also still blurry enough that we're not seeing the finer details. By finer details, you really can't see where the eyes of the dog are going. They could be looking straight towards us this way. They could be looking slightly off to the side. There's not really a fine detail to tell on that one. As well, too, the coloration, we can make out that there's some brown spots on the dog, but we can't necessarily make out the sharpest detail, especially not like we can when we're looking at the nose and the whiskers and the different coloration there. Moving over to the squirrel, we have a very similar situation, except the background is even blurred more so. Now we can see the squirrel, we can see part of the branch here is caught in that focus as well. However, everything else is blurred out. Now, judging by this little bit of shrubbery that's up here from like a pine tree or what have you, I can almost guarantee that this is going to all be some form of tree that's around the physical squirrel. However, the branches are blurred out enough that we get the color, we get the essence, yet we can't we can't tell the background out perfectly. This is probably where we're sitting at something closer to a 1.4 to 2.8, where we can see that there's something behind the squirrel, we can see everything that's going on, but we can't make out that background at all. That's what aperture control gives us when we're just shooting with the aperture priority, and that's what aperture really stands for. It's that foreground to background relationship that we're trying to get at. In the case of the squirrel here, we probably don't care about what the background is. We're probably just focused on the squirrel eating on the tree branch looking kind of cute. We're also probably not focused in on what's going on in the background here because we want the ridges and the bumps of the nose and that detail right there. Now, if we didn't want that, we could raise our aperture up, get it as close to 22 as we can, and then from there, we should be able to incorporate a picture where both dogs are matching, or in the other one, the squirrel and the tree is very noticeable. Now, other reasons we might like to use aperture priority by itself is for an effect called bokeh. Now, bokeh really only comes into play when you have a lens that has an aperture of 1.8 or lower. And what bokeh basically does is it takes whatever subject matter that you have, so in this case a little Lego character, and it focuses in on the character or the person or the object, and lights that are in the background become blurred out, but blurred out to the point where they become these dots. The lights that are behind the little figure are just Christmas lights. But when blurred out like this, they almost just look like little blobs of light in the background, and you don't see anything else. When you're taking portrait photography, people will light their studio or their setting up, or maybe even if you're just shooting a picture outside and you have natural light coming from another direction and it's reflecting off something else, that light, when it's properly put down on the aperture to a lower number, can actually become these circular blobs of light that add on to whatever we're trying to shoot. So bokeh effect is really nice if you're doing portraits and if you're really trying to bring in more of a creative style or look to it. Does it have any other really functions or features? Not necessarily. It's more of a creative choice that some artists and photographers will make. Now, why do we want to just use aperture priority versus using automatic versus using manual? Aperture priority is really great when you have situations like this where you're not necessarily caring about the speed of your shutter. You don't necessarily care about your ISO. You're more so focused on the relationships that you're creating between the background and the foreground of your subjects or of your pictures. It's your way of basically being able to say you're on vacation. Let's say the kids are in front of the cruise ship you're going on. Of course you want to take a picture of both of them in the same shot and have that forever. But if the kids are standing in front of a wall and they're just wearing their Sunday best suits on, you probably don't care about the wall itself, you just care about what they're wearing and how they look. So you'll blur the background out in order to make sure it's just a focus on the people that you're trying to take pictures of. Whereas in a situation like this, we probably want the beautiful sunrise, water, and what looks to be a little waterfall or a cavern of some sort off on the distance there too. As well too as our model, wife, girlfriend, whoever this might be, our sister, we want the whole shot. So we'd want a higher aperture priority on there in order to encompass this entire picture. So using priority can either be one of the things where you're using it because you're going to be going in and out of different scenarios where you might not care about the background, you might care about the background, so that's something you want to play with. Aperture priority also could be just a way for you to control the aperture and let the camera do the rest of the work because you understand how the aperture works on the camera lens itself.
This is a situation in ISO is auto.
So you can use auto. Yeah, ISO would be fine if you have it on auto in this case. Yeah, you can leave ISO on auto. Yeah. ISO, no matter what on the priority modes, you're able to change that no matter what. So if you want ISO to be an 800, on the priority mode you can set ISO to be your 800 and then continue to just use aperture priority. But if you'd rather, you can let ISO be automatic and let it adjust with everything the camera's doing. All you're controlling is that aperture ring on the camera. Review one more time. So, some lenses can get all the way up to f32. This would be probably one of the most wide open lenses that you can get. With that being said, the iris of the camera is super, super tiny, but what we're able to pick up is a piece of wood, the water, the grass, what seems to be a parking lot, a garbage can, and then the kind of grassy field all behind it. As we start to cut that number down, we're going to blur that background out just a little more slightly, keeping our tree, our main subject, in the foreground in complete focus. We get down to 6.3, and honestly, if you didn't have these two images right next to it, you probably wouldn't be able to tell that's a garbage can, but you would see that little bit of blue and whatever else this could be in the corner there. So it might be distracting, especially if this is all you're trying to encapsulate. F2.8, though, we completely get rid of all of that. Now we just have green, a little bit of blue or black, brown, and then the water even with the grass kind of meshes together for this grayish, more beige color. But our piece of wood is still in focus. So using something like our aperture priority, the higher the number, the more of the entire image we're going to see. The lower the number, the only thing we're going to see is the focus or the subject matter that we're trying to mainly capture. Now we move into shutter speed. Now shutter speed, it doesn't matter what lens you have. With aperture priority, the better your lens, the lower of an aperture you can get, meaning the more background blur that you can have occur on your photo. When it comes to shutter speed though, it's all dependent on the camera body that you have. Your camera body will have where when you're turning the shutter priority on this camera, it'll tell you the max speed it can go, and it can tell you the slowest speed that it can go. A standard photo, I would say for somebody that's just moving around, not doing too much, is usually between 60 to 250. I'd say that's your average photo, where your subject matter isn't running around too much. They might be walking from corner to corner. They might be a bird that's kind of hopping around and doing something light, but it's not in full flight. This also could be just if you're walking around on vacation and you're going through a town that has a marketplace and you want to take photos, that sort of thing. 60 to 250 is a medium to moderate pace where you're not going slow, but you're not going extremely fast on the shutter speed. With shutter, what we're looking at on this whole thing is that it's 1 second with whatever then it's divided by on the bottom there. So in this case, it's 1 125ths of a second, 1 250ths of a second, 1 500ths of a second. What we're doing is we are taking our shutter and we are opening and closing it in a speed in which that we are trying to capture whatever the motion or the movement of this photo is. So in this case we have someone that's jogging or walking. 1 in 500 keeps them in perfect stillness. But as we start to slow the shutter speed down, we get more motion blur. We get more movement that's coming from our physical photo. So when we're using the shutter priority, camera's doing all the work of ISO, it's doing the work of aperture, of background to foreground separation. What we're controlling is the speed at which the shutters are opening and closing to make sure we get this freeze frame of an image, depending on what we're taking pictures of. This is going to be controlled via another dial on the camera. Depending on the setting that you're using, it should be the same dial that you were just switching for the aperture priority. However, if you're in full manual, they'll usually tell you have to hold down one button and then turn that dial in order to do it. But if we're just sitting in shutter priority, then it should either be the same dial or another dial that's on the camera. Again, it all depends on the age of the camera itself. Faster. Good.
I just took a couple pictures at 1/4000, and they just didn't tell you they were like all black.
Because that's very fast. 1 in 4,000 is like.
So it's just, it has to be like super bright out, or?
In a sense, yeah. You've got to just have the right settings on there for that one. If it's going that dark and you're trying to shoot at 1 in 4,000, which usually, unless it's someone who's doing like, unless it's NASCAR, no one's shooting at 1 in 4,000.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So typically, and I'll have another slide that talks about like 1 in 1,000 being the perfect action photography speed. You're not really going to use 1 in 4,000 unless you're doing like a NASCAR event. And in that case, then you want to play with your ISO and you want to play with your aperture priority, because those are going to balance each other out, and then that'll help you get more of a clear picture. The faster your picture goes, the more then you have to readjust the other settings on the camera.
Okay, yeah, because I guess, okay.
So the slower that we go when we're taking the photo, the more blur that we're going to occur, especially if there's movement going on. The faster we go, the more still we're going to get the image. If we go too fast, though, based on what the image is, if there's not a lot of light or there's not a lot of just sensitivity that the camera can pick up on, then it's going to produce an all-black photo like what yours just did. If we have action speed or action photography, so if we're trying to catch a baseball game of our kids, or a football or basketball game, and we've got people running around and doing sports and activities, 1 in 1,000 is usually one of the safer numbers to be at. If it still is coming out blurry, then go faster with it. Typically though, usually I'd say 1 in 1,000, 1 in 2,000 is a good number for most people to be at. An image like this would have been shot at 1 in 1,000 shutter speed. Now that being said, because this is most likely done with full manual controls, the person who's shooting this is also manipulating their ISO and is also manipulating their aperture in order to bring the most amount of light into the camera, given that their shutter speed is faster. Think about it, if your camera's main job is to pick up on light and the light sensitivity, the faster we put that shutter speed, the harder it is for our camera to absorb and take in all that light. So if we're on shutter priority, our camera should do a pretty good job of readjusting its rest of its settings, so that way it can balance out having the super fast speed based on the other settings that the camera has. But if we're shooting on full manual and we're getting this where it's not looking right as the image, then we need to readjust other settings, whether that be our ISO or whether that be our aperture. The nice thing with using shutter priority, even if we have a little bit of motion blur, we're giving a nice sense of motion when it comes to our photos. So shutter as a whole is not like aperture, where we're really trying to focus on that foreground and background separation. In the case of shutter priority, we're looking at motion. We're looking at how still or how flat the photo is and what we can do to add to that. Blur is not always necessarily a bad thing. In this case, the wings are blurry, and we can see that detail being lost as this, woodpecker, I believe it is. Hummingbird. Its wings go real fast. It is fluttering at a very, very fast speed. That being said, unless you've got a super fast camera, you're probably not going to be able to capture those wings in perfect stillness. However though, because its body itself isn't actually moving, we can see how crisp the body of the bird is, between the red on the beak, the brown, yellow, and green feathering that we see towards the belly as well too. Where the light is hitting on the bird as well looks really nice. And if you look closely, it looks like it caught some sort of bug or fly on there. So if we can give, or one of the things when it comes to our shutter photography is giving that sense of motion, is trying to capture the bird or whatever the subject matter is, either in perfect stillness or allowing for a little bit of motion blur or blur to happen to help give a sense of movement or motion. So blur is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing, but if you can find a balance with it, then you will have something that has some motion to it or has just a little extra oomph to it. We can also use shutter priority to create mood or to help with saturation of colors via long exposure. So with shutter priority, not only do you have the ability to go extremely fast, where you have the 1/500ths, or like we just talked about, if you've got action sports or lots of movement, 1 in 1,000 would be great. Or if you're trying to shoot NASCAR, 1 in 4,000 would probably be better for that. If we want to get more saturation in our colors, or we want to create more mood or depth, then we can look at doing something like long exposure. Long exposure can go for as long as you want it to be. So in this case, you've got 1/4 of a second, 1/2 a second. You can let your shutter stay open for a full second, for a full 4 seconds. You can even use B on the camera, which is bulb, and bulb allows for the sensor to be open the entire time until you press again and close it. What that's doing is creating long exposure photography. And why we care about long exposure photography is because it's one of the best ways for us to saturate and get the best color spectrum on our photos. So we can create mood, we can create a lot of different textures, and we really can bring color into the foreground and back into the background. So for example, on this one, you've got all these different greens and mosses and browns from the rocks. You can really tell all the different colors, even from a little further back. I know I can't, so I'm right up on it. But with the way the green changes colors in between, and you can see the depth of the stacking of the colors on there. Same thing with the foliage over here. You've got really bright green, but then you've got these pockets of just dead plants or dead foliage. On top of that too, you can see the little bits and pieces of the rocks, not only just where there's no water, but even where the water is coming down. Because what's happening with our camera is we're leaving the shutter open wide for, let's say, 10 seconds. Within that 10 seconds, water is coming down. The camera is going to blur out whatever is moving. So in a lot of the cases when it comes to long exposure still photography, a tripod or a stand is necessary. Without it, your photos will look awful. As long as you have that piece there and you've got the camera balanced properly, the camera's going to read the rocks and it's going to see the detail that's coming in on there. Where we're going to see the mood or the movement or the blur, it's going to be the water itself, because the water's spread. There are certain areas, like where the little ridges are and certain waterfall areas where the water is consistently falling in one spot. But then there's a lot of other areas where we can see this haze that's around the water, because the water is unpredictable. It's moving in all different sorts of directions. But the main focus on this might not necessarily be the blur from the water. It's probably going to be the focus of the color, the saturation of the color, all of the different red ridges and grooves that we're able to see from the photograph. So long exposure might be tricky to start with. You'll have to make sure you've got proper balance with the camera and no movement. And it's also a touch and feel type thing, because you want to make sure that you're exposing your picture for whatever the most appropriate amount of time is in order to get a fully detailed and saturated image like this. Another example of long exposure. So in this case, the camera's probably on some sort of park bench or on the bench at this train station. Gentleman has the bike himself, and then he's got the roof of the actual train station and the platform for the train station. Those 4 things are perfect. There's no movement on there, there's no blur, we can see him in full detail. The train is whizzing past him as this is happening, and that's what these lights that are cutting across the way are. It's the fact that the train is not in perfect stillness, yet there's motion, there's movement, so there's a sense of mood with that one. Because the train naturally has separation between the cars, as that train is going by, the camera can then also see behind the train in a sense. So it's able to then start writing out what it sees behind it. So it looks like those are storefronts right behind the train. There's somebody's name, it's like OFRG Hotel. It looks like there's some more stuff on the bottom there too. So because of that little bit of gap and because the camera is staying perfectly still, we're gonna get this excellent saturation of color where we can see the water damage on the ceiling, we can see the mud all along the bottom of the bike, we can see the folds in perfect form and color on the pants, we can also see the mud and the spokes all over the tires, yet the train is giving us our motion, it's giving us our mood of whizzing past our character, if you will. Something like that too, depending on the rest of your settings, that could be an exposure that only took 5 seconds to do. That could be an exposure that took 15 seconds to do. It's one of those things where long exposure photography, it takes touch and feel. If you're ever looking to really have fun with it, astrophotography is really awesome. If you have a clear day, put your camera on a tripod, point it up to the sky and let it sit for 15 seconds. It'll really take some detailed, deep, saturated colors. And if the camera is powerful enough that it can get some of the stars and the moon, you'll be able to pick up all of that on the saturation of the physical frame. So it's a really nice feature to play with long exposure. Astrophotography is an easy way to do it. If you live by an expressway of some kind too, what people might do sometimes is they'll point the camera towards the expressway, let it run for a while, and you get these strips of lights that come off the cars where it almost looks like it's just whizzing past. That's similar to what we're seeing in the train, where we can see the lights of the train whizzing past in that straight omnidirectional line. So you can, it's pretty easy to play with and do. You just have to test and feel it out. Why use shutter priority? I think this is my best example for why you should use it. I had a customer email me this photo as well, and they said my camera doesn't work. Your camera works, you just don't know how to use the shutter priority. So in this case, you've got some ultimate frisbee happening in downtown Chicago at one of the parks at Lincoln Park there. They're just trying to get a picture of someone throwing the frisbee, but because they're not using the proper speed of the shutter, they're getting a slow photo that looks extremely blurry. So when we were looking at that first slide and we saw our running man with the blur around it, that would have been because we used too slow of a speed based on the speed of which our subjects were moving. So we need to readjust our camera to make sure we have the proper shutter speed in order to get an image of them in perfect stillness with no blur. This excess amount of motion blur is probably not going to be ideal for your photos. If there was slight motion blur on his hands or on their legs, most people would be just fine with that because they still got the essence of the photo. But in this case, so much is muddled and so much is lost that changing our speed, in this case maybe something that's closer to 1 1,000th of speed, is going to be better or more beneficial to get the image that we're trying to get. Again, looking at another example, you've got the guy who's doing motocross. They're only in the air for maybe 3 to 4 seconds if you're counting fast. They're not up there for a long period of time. So if your shutter speed is slow shutter speed, not near that 1 1,000th mark, you're probably not going to be able to get this image in perfect stillness. Last thing we'll talk about to bring it all home before we get into lenses and kind of talk a little bit more with some examples is ISO. So ISO is going to be your camera's sensitivity towards light. If you ever had the experience or joy of shooting on film, that number that's written on your film, whether that was Kodak 100 or Ilford 400 or Sempex 200, those terms were the sensitivity towards the light. So on the film itself, there was an emulsion on there. That emulsion has a certain level of sensitivity. The more sensitive that would be, the more for dark or nighttime photography it would be recommended. The lower the number, the more for daytime, midday photography, things where you have good lighting is more appropriate. In the case of the digital world, they changed it, so now the sensor that you have in your camera, you can adjust or change that ISO at any point in time that you want without necessarily having to worry about taking a roll of film out or finishing it up. Changing the sensitivity will basically help for your camera to distinguish more light that's available to it and then pull that in to then either illuminate the photo more or to just give off a sense of maybe more a lighter day or less overcast or what have you there. So when we look at the same image here, all of these images were taken with the same shutter speed and aperture, but their ISO is slightly different. When we start with the sunset on ISO 100, the colors in the back are muted. We don't have a lot of reflection coming off the water here. The beach is extremely dark. It just overall doesn't look very friendly or inviting. 200, we really start to see more of the sky on this one. The beach lightens up and the water also has a little bit more of a shine or a lightness to it. But it's not until we get to the 400 and even the 800 where we really see the full spectrum of the sky, the red, the yellow, the blue, the orange, the purple. And then on top of that too, we have this really nice shade or shadow that's just underneath the bridge with the nice reflection coming off the water there. We can clearly see the beach in both of those photos. So changing the ISO on our photo, especially if it's a darker image, is a really nice thing to do without having to update or change the other settings on your camera, because all it's doing is giving your camera a little bit more sensitivity towards the available light that it has. Now where we have to be careful with this is the fact that when we're using ISO, ISO can also equate to noise. Noise is going to be that like static TV feeling or that, pixelation, kind of grimy look. It's not going to look right. The reason being is that if you turn your ISO up too high and the camera has a good amount of available light to it, it's going to naturally create this grain. The reason it's doing that is because your sensor is too overpowered by the amount of light that it sees. So if you start taking pictures and this is the result that you're getting where it looks like the TV static, then you're going to want to turn that ISO down and find the appropriate number. For the same image taken at the same time, the same day, you've got ISO 100 with clear blue skies. Lighting is okay on the tower itself. I believe that's the Empire State Building, or Chrysler. It's one of the two. I know it's New York. Either way, ISO 100, you can see the detail of the buildings. You can see the skyline. It doesn't look like it's lost. With 3200, we've gone up such a significant amount, and because there's enough light that's either coming from just the sunset or from the building itself, it's causing this pixelation that's now spreading across our entire photo. So ISO is a great tool to use, but too much of the ISO can give you a lot of noise on your image. Whereas then having less ISO might make the camera less sensitive towards the light, but it'll give you a more clean image. That's where either using auto ISO is a great feature, or being able to manually change not only your ISO, but your shutter priority and your aperture priority will help too. If that aperture is a little bit bigger, so almost down to the smaller numbers, you're letting in a significant amount more light. If you change the shutter speed and make it a lower shutter speed, well then it should also help bring in more light. If that's the case, mix it with a lower ISO number, and you probably don't need to worry about having something as high as 3200, especially if you're getting an image that looks like this. So auto ISO is great because that naturally will do it for you. It senses the amount of light that's in the area based on the other settings you have with your camera, and it finds the sweet spot for you. But if you're manually controlling ISO, sometimes it's nice, you don't have to necessarily go in and change your ISO every single time. You might just need to readjust your shutter or your aperture on there in order to bring more light into the camera. Auto ISO, when to use it, I have a parent that comes in maybe every few months. There's something going on for her kid all the time, whether it's prom or homecoming or a senior night or something else. And she'll ask me for advice on settings. And one of the big things I told her she should be using is auto ISO. And the reason I told her that was because in her situation, she was going for prom photos where she was going to be indoors and outdoors. They were taking pictures by a fountain outdoors, and they went to someone's house and they had nice pictures in front of a fireplace. Then they got to the venue itself, which had low lights and dimmed lights, so they had a different environment with different lighting on there. I recommended using auto ISO because it took one less thing off of her plate. The camera does a really good job, especially these new mirrorless cameras, of reading the light that's available to it. Sony cameras can get all the way up to 240,000 ISO, which basically means that if you have a street lamp that's a block over, it's going to take a highly detailed picture of all its surroundings, and you can zoom in and get a lot of detail out of it. So newer cameras have a fantastic low light performance to them. In that case, we don't really necessarily need to putz around with our ISO too much. We can let the camera drive that, and we can focus on things like our aperture, or that foreground to background relationship, or that shutter speed. If we've got kids playing baseball and we want to make sure we get a good picture of them sliding into a second or third, that's where then we don't necessarily need to worry about this, and we can just focus on the other settings of our camera.
If we put the flash in the start,
Yeah,
we should ISO doesn't work.
it should. It still does work on there. It just, it changes.
If auto doesn't work, it's forward. They don't go up or down.
It depends on the camera and depends on the settings.
Oh, I
On some of my cameras, so on my Sony and on my Fujifilm camera, if I have a flash that's on there, ISO still stays enabled. All I have to do is
I don't
change
know,
it.
this never. With the flash,
Okay.
this only forward.
Yeah.
If it dark, forward. They
It
don't go up. Maybe
might-
setting, I don't know.
Might be the setting. It's also a DSLR. So
Yeah,
DSLRs
DSLR, yeah.
exactly are a lot different than the mirrorless are.
Oh,
Because
okay.
now the mirrorless can go up to 204,000 ISO, whereas with yours, I think you tap out at about 6,400.
You talked about the DSLR.
This is for both. This is for both types of cameras. Yeah.
You know why the setting, you know?
I don't know off the top of my head. We'd have to look at it and see. But if that's what you're getting off of there, then
Yeah,
it's
with the flash only.
it's
Otherwise,
m-
no problem.
yeah, it's most likely because it's a DSLR and it just can't compute with that power.
Yeah.
So to review it all together in one kind of sweep, you've got your f-stop on the top, you've got our shutter in the middle, and we've got our ISO on the bottom. The scenery for the first picture are two stuffed animal piggies on top of a couch. With f16, we can clearly see the back pillows of the couch, what seems to be kind of the corner of a room, and then a table. As we slowly start to lower that number down, we're blurring out that background, focusing more on just the stuffed animals in our foreground, and losing or pushing away the rest of it. So depending on what we're taking pictures of with our f-stop, if we're doing aperture priority, our main focus here is going to be that relationship that we're establishing between the foreground and the background of our subject matter. How much do we care about the background? Is it important? Do we need it? Are we doing portrait photography? How much light are we letting in, especially when we're considering all three of these acting together? That's important things to think about in the full manual setting. With shutter priority, we're focusing on the speed at which we're capturing the picture. When we shoot with a faster speed, we are able to get something moving in full speed or full motion in almost perfect stillness. So we have a hand that's coming down and hitting a hammer into a board. The hand at 1 in 1,000 is perfect. We can see the hand, we can see the knuckles wrapped around it, and we can see the red-handled hammer with the silver head. But as we start to slow that speed down, now we're starting to get more motion blur. Because that swing is coming from the wrist, we're able to see most of the hand in perfect stillness, but the actual hammer is now getting blurry because that's the part that's moving the quickest. And as we keep lowering that speed and going down and down, it's getting more blurry and blurry as we go. The thing that doesn't get blurry in any of these pictures is the piece of wood though. Because that piece of wood is perfectly still, it's not moving, it's staying stationary no matter how slow or however how fast we move. So if we have a moving object, we want to make sure that we have faster shutter speeds. Because we're going to have faster shutter speeds, we're going to need to readjust things like our aperture or our shutter. Remember that if we have something like an f16, that's going to make the iris super small. So we want to make sure that we raise our number up to a different area if we're going to shoot with something like a 1 in 1,000. So that way we bring or allow more light to come into the camera with a faster speed, which is going to push more light out. Where then that then ties in more is with ISO, because ISO is going to be that sensitivity that we're getting on the sensor to make sure we're reading light properly. So at ISO 100, we have the corner of a penny and we have what seems to be like a black wooden countertop table of some sort. We can see the folds on the wood, we can see the different grain on there. On the penny itself, we can see the edges, where the scent is, and just in general where the shapes and everything is. As we start to raise our ISO up and make things more sensitive, we start to wash the color out a little bit more. Things feel like they're becoming more staticky and more pixelated, but on top of that, the wood looks lighter. The penny doesn't look as defined on those sharper edges. So by raising the ISO up, yes, we're making our camera more sensitive to light. In dark or extremely dark situations, higher ISO is going to be great because it's going to then be able to allow us to get more light out of the subject that we're taking pictures of. Now, if we're using that in conjunction with the rest of these guys, we have to be aware that having a high ISO, even if it is nighttime, maybe having a high shutter speed and a lower aperture to give us more light might be too much light, because now we are not only subjecting our sensor to as much light as possible, but we've turned that sensitivity up in a way where maybe now we start to get very pixelated photos. So if we start playing with our ISO, it's important that we remember that shutter speed is going to affect how much light is coming into the camera. So we need to make sure that we are setting our shutter speed more appropriately based on the ISO that we're using. And in conjunction with all of that, depending on how much light and what our foreground-background relationship is, we might now need to start manipulating the f-stop. That, in its sense, is all full manual control, where you're not just controlling one feature over the other, you're controlling all three at the same time. You can set ISO to be automatic on any of these settings, whether that's aperture priority, or shutter priority, or full manual. Some people prefer that because they believe that the camera's smart enough to dictate light and to detect that. These sensors have become more advanced for that reason, and I fall into that category too. I typically don't set my ISO unless it's a beautiful day or an overcast day. Sometimes I'll set my ISO to about that 100 to 400 range for a nice kind of regular sunny day. And if I notice it's a little darker, I sometimes go up to 800, usually never more than 1,000. And if I'm shooting in the dead of night, then I usually just let my camera run on automatic, and it dictates then based on my other settings. For me personally, I shoot with the aperture priority almost all the time. My main focus when I'm taking pictures is how much of the background I want to blur out and how much of the foreground I want to keep. My camera can dictate the speed for me unless I'm doing sports photography or I'm taking pictures for an event where they're running or doing activities. That would be the only time I'd switch in my personal repertoire. Other than that, if I'm shooting full manual, I'm still going to keep ISO at automatic, and I'm just going to focus on these two features myself. But depending on how much control you want as the photographer, you have the ability in full manual to control all three. And if that's not what you're looking to do, then once you get past automatic and you understand it, play with the aperture priority, play with shutter priority. You might use one over the other depending on the situation that you're shooting. One could be the vacation photos where you're in front of the boat or the cruise ship. You're going to all these monuments and national places around the world. Aperture might be better for that. Get the foreground, background separation, blur things out that you don't want, capture other things that you do. You might be at your kid's t-ball game and they're running from home to first. That's where then shutter priority is probably going to be more appropriate. It would be a real bummer if you took a picture of Billy or Susie and they were extremely blurry and you couldn't even make out that that was your kid. But if we can then change the shutter speed so that way we're capturing appropriately for the speed at which those kids are running around, then we're going to get crisper, cleaner images with better outlines and better results.
For the ISO, when you get up to the high, you're not picking up additional details. You're basically like ruining the picture.
No, it's not that you're ruining the picture, it's you're absorbing more light that's around. The more light that you absorb in can be a bad thing, because if you take too much light that's around you, it's going to cause grain to come up on the photos.
Right, but you're not finding additional imperfections in the penny on the right.
You might. I mean, depending on where you're at with your shutter and your
But at some point you just are ruining the picture.
Not necessarily. It's all situational. It's all dependent on the environment that you're in, how much light's coming out, where your light source is. For example, we've got canned recessed lighting in here, and it's also going to be more of an orangey tone, so it's sitting on more of that warmer Kelvin scale. Probably shooting somewhere closer to 640, maybe 1,000, but that might be pushing it, but I'd say between 640 and 400 would be an appropriate ISO for this room. Now, if I go outside and I've got good sunlight and good everything else, 100 is probably just enough. But where I live in Chicago, we've got street lights at literally 5 down every single block. If I switch my ISO up to about 40,000, 10,000, I can take a picture of that street light, even if everything else is pitch black, and that street light will look perfect. So it's all situational, it's all dependent. There's no kind of one way around it. The best thing I can tell people is that it's practice and it's touch and feel. If ISO feels like it's too complicated, keep it on auto. you probably won't notice the difference on there. Focus in on things like the shutter and the aperture, because in my opinion, that makes or breaks the photo on there. ISO is something that you can learn with time, but at the same time, you can literally just let it run on auto, and the camera's sensor and everything else on the inside do a really great job of dictating what light is available. Now, if you are shooting on an older camera, that can be a problem. Typically with your DSLRs, you really do want to control ISO, and for most people, a lower number will do the trick for you. When you get into mirrorless, that's when the intelligence on the camera is a little bit better, and because that sensor is what's reading the light immediately, it's not the mirror, that it's a little bit quicker to judge. So that's another thing to keep in mind too. With ISO though, and with all those other things being said, if you've set your camera and you've got it in the perfect setting and it looks okay, but it still looks dark to you, and if you start tweaking things and it still feels either too light or too dark, then there's the exposure meter on your camera. All cameras have exposure compensation, and that's usually symbolized by a little box. It'll be black and white, it'll have a plus and a minus sign on that box. And what the exposure compensation is it takes the entirety of the frame and it makes it darker or lighter based on a full stop, which is usually going to be a little number or a little kind of check mark, if you will, or it's going to then have quarter and half stops in between. What that's doing is it's adding more light or more exposure to your frame. If you were to use film and you were under a big exposure unit, you might let your film get burned into the piece of paper for a longer period of time in order to make up for the exposure, or you might then let it be exposed for a couple seconds less to undershoot that exposure and give you a darker image. In this case of the camera, we can do this all right from the camera itself, just by clicking that button and raising or lowering our dial. So if we go lower with it, we're going to make our image darker. If we go higher with it, we're going to make it lighter. I like to use exposure compensation when I am in a setting on my camera where I've toned it all in, I know exactly what I'm getting out of it, but the image still feels either too dark or too light, and when I try to tweak other settings on there, I'm not getting what I want, what I just got. In that case, if it's too light, I might go one stop down, and if that feels like it's too dark, maybe I just go up a quarter of a stop to give myself a little bit more darkness on the frame without making it look like there's just shadow everywhere. And in the vice versa of it, let's say it's nighttime, I take a picture, my settings are all where I want them to be, but it's still too dark. Well, then maybe I then move it up one and a quarter of a stop to bring in more light to make the frame itself more exposed to the light. And then from there, I can tone it down until I have my image looking perfect. So exposure compensation is one of those things that once you set your ISO, you've set your shutter, and you've set your aperture priority, you can start to go through with this one and see how much lighter or darker you can make that frame, which in turn might then help bring out more detail or take away detail too, depending. So it's very similar to ISO, but it functions where ISO is looking for the lightest points when you're shooting a picture and soaking in all that light. Exposure is taking the entirety of the frame and making it darker or lighter based on whatever preference you choose. Like I said earlier, full manual is now full control over both the aperture and the shutter speed. Where we're just talking about it, we're saying that aperture controls that foreground and background, and shutter is controlling the shutter release and the speed at which that's closing. Both of these two now come together, and you're now controlling basically what a film camera would have just had you control, because ISO would have been whatever the number on the film was, and all you're doing is controlling that background to foreground relationship, and then the speed at which the camera's firing. So this part of the class, I like to take photos and I like to look at them, and I kind of give everybody a juxtaposition of what I'm seeing on the photo and what I would say that equates to on the camera settings. So the three main things we're going to talk about are your ISO, your aperture priority, and then your shutter speed. I'll go through and explain what I see. If someone sees something different or wants to question about a photo and how they might have done that, by all means stop me. Starting with aperture, I'm going to say that this is close to an f/22, possibly an f/16 depending on the lens. The reason I say that is because you get the entirety of the image, whether that is the foreground, which could be the steps right here, or the bars that are coming up on this bridge. But then if you look towards the building, you can see that you're still seeing the building. There's not a lot of blurriness there. So again, nice wide open aperture getting in both the background and the foreground.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Is that why my clouds are always gray skies? Like, if there's like if it's a partly cloudy day and there's like some blue and some gray, my pictures are always all gray.
Have to see the image to see.
Probably because the F was too low.
I don't think so, only because for the most part, I mean, your lenses don't have that power on there, so yours wouldn't be doing that. It might be the ISO on there, it also just could be the camera by itself. So if you have examples of that, we can take a look at the settings and see what's going on.
I'm not able to do that.
Yeah, but whatever. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
So aperture wise, we're probably going to be something closer to that f16, f22. ISO, because of how bright some of these windows are, and because of how light some of these are, we're getting some light flare that's coming off of them. So the ISO is a little bit higher, and I can also see in the darkest parts there is a little bit of speckling from the grain, from the pixelation. So ISO is probably going to be somewhere closer to that 1000 range, maybe 800 range, when it could be toned down a little bit more, given how much light is coming off of the buildings. As far as shutter speed, there's not a lot of movement going on, because we've got our aperture wide open, we've got our aperture wide open for the most part, and we've got our ISO turned up. Probably would say this is close to 1 250th of a second. Maybe the lowest I would say is 1/60th of a second.
Sorry, like this one right here. It's like a house, right? It's f10.
F10 with a shutter speed of 400 and ISO of 500. So overcast day, I mean, it doesn't look like there was really any clouds though in the background. Because it really just looks like it's overcast.
Alright, let's go find another one.
I would say if you really want to practice with it, you need to find like a nice bright sunny day, point towards the clouds and then take a picture of it. That'll tell you kind of right off the bat. But it looks like in that situation that it was an overcast day and there really wasn't major cloud formations.
I think that, okay. Interesting.
So now we've got our cherry blossoms. We can see that these couple branches right in the front are nice and saturated in the foreground there. So aperture priority on this is probably going to be closer to maybe a 4 or a 5 at the highest, maybe a 2.8 at the lowest, because we can still make out the background being other cherry blossoms. However, they are blurred out enough that we really can't make out the finer details of if they've opened or if that's just the bulb of it by itself. But we can tell that there are more branches full of them in the background. The sunlight looks wonderful in this picture, and there's not a lot of shade or shadow going on. So I probably would say that ISO is closer to that ISO 100, maybe 200 at the lowest. And then shutter speed, because there's no movement going on, unless the wind is blowing these branches, it's probably going to sit somewhere at that 1 100th speed, 1 1/60th of a speed. So again, slower speed, lower ISO because we got natural sunlight going on, but a lot of background to foreground separation to separate and really just focus on these few branches in the front. So similar to that dog photo that we had in the beginning where we talked about aperture priority, we have one fireman standing in the foreground, one fireman standing in the background. The fireman in the back is pretty blurred out. Not enough that we can't tell that it's another fireman, but enough that we really can't make out where the eyes are looking and the exact facial expression. We can make out that he's got a similar helmet, if not the same. It looks like he's got the same walkie-talkie that this guy has on his jacket as well too. So aperture-wise, you're probably not as low as a 1.4, but you're probably close to that 2.8, maybe a 2 as well. Where again, you can tell that that's a person behind him, but you really can't make out the finer details of that person. Lighting in this doesn't look like it's all that good, but it does look very dramatic. So lighting looks like it's coming from this corner and then hitting our fireman on this face, giving a shadow on the face, shadow on the helmet. So ISO is probably somewhere around 400, 500 in this case to give it that little bit of dramaticism, but without making things like the black on his collar or in the black of the shadow right here look pixelated or blurry. Shutter speed in this case also probably be pretty low, just because unless they're walking or they're doing something, if this is a photo where they're not really doing much, if they're just modeling, they're probably sitting somewhere between that 1/60th to 1 250th of a second. Given the ISO and given the background blur, they probably could get away with a little bit of a faster shutter speed. So 2/50th is what probably the max I would say on this one. This one has some debate every class that I teach with it. We can't tell if this is a fake or like a stuffed goat or if this is a real goat. The only reason I don't think it's a real goat is because I don't think anyone can really get that close without getting headbutted by one of these. I think it's more of like an exhibit at like a field museum type thing. Anywho, foreground to background relationship. The background itself is pretty blurred out on that case. You could probably tell that those are either sticks, a tree, and then a snow-covered background. However, we can't see the finer details of all of that. So I probably would put this at a maximum of 4. Not as low as like a 1.4, but maybe a 2.8. So 2.8 to 4 is what I would say the aperture relationship between these are. As far as the ISO goes, the light in here feels very cool, and it feels like it's coming from the top and coming downwards. So we're getting light on the antlers, we're getting light on the top of the nose, but areas like the cheek cavity and obviously underneath this guy are going to be really dark. So ISO as a whole, just given too that we have a nice dark tree in the background that's there, it's probably going to be a little higher. I would probably put this closer to an 800, and at the lowest maybe a 4, maybe a 5. So somewhere between that range. This is where shutter speed I think comes into this, because unless this is a moving goat, you're probably going to want a faster shutter speed, which that could affect the ISO and bring that effectively down a little bit. But because I think this is stuffed, I'm going to say it's probably a slower shutter speed of 1 1/60th of a second up to 1 250th of a second.
I agree that it's a fake goat.
I think it's a fake goat. Yeah, I don't think that's real. I think it's might have been real, but it was stuffed. I don't know, but I don't think it's real. This is one of my favorite ones. So this now can convey a little more speed. Because we have these dogs airborne and they're jumping in the sky, we definitely have a shutter speed of 1 in 1,000 or faster in this case. The only reason I think that 1 in 1,000 would have been more than enough for this is because you have a lot of sunlight coming on from the top and hitting our dogs. So we can see that nice shadow that's dropping on the floor on both of these. So with that being said, ISO is probably 1 in 100. Our shutter is going to be lower, our aperture is going to be lower, closer to that 1.4, 2.8, because we can really not see a lot of the background. However, we can make out that that's probably trees. This is probably a dog park of some sort with cars parked along the back there. But the background is blurred out enough that, again, our main focus, our main subject matter are the dogs going airborne against the frisbees. So aperture is low, it's a 1.4 to 2.8, I would say, probably a 2 to 1.4 more realistically. Speed is going to be 1 in 1,000th, and then ISO maybe is 1 in 100th, or 100 ISO. At most, it's about 200, maybe 400 ISO, but I probably would say closer to 200, because if we were to oversaturate this with such a fast shutter speed and with such a wide open aperture, we would let too much light in, which would then give us some pixelation or blurriness, especially in the darker parts of the fur, or where that tree branch in the background is, or even on some of the darker parts here where the toes are on this guy and the top of the fur. I'm not seeing a lot of pixelation or blur. So again, lower ISO, wide open aperture at that 1.4, and then shutter speed is going to be the fastest, most important part of this whole thing. This is one of the last images before we get into lenses, but another example of speed or motion. You've got a football player from Navy jumping into the end zone to score a touchdown. It's a diving play. It looks like he probably broke some sort of tackle in the background, so you have another guy on the ground, or maybe that dude was tripped. But either way, he's jumping into the end zone, he's running fast down the field, so we're at least shooting at 1 in 1,000th of speed or faster. We've got a lot of light coming in, and the light is coming from the top a little bit further back. It's hitting the back of the helmet, leaving the front of the helmet dark, but then making this nice drop shadow on there. So there's a good amount of light in the stadium. You're probably also looking at an ISO of 100 to 200, similar to what our dogs were like when we were just looking at that. Now, as far as the aperture is concerned, it's not going to be as severe as the dogs, where we couldn't make out the background, and we could tell that those might have been trees or shrubs or a park, because we could see the green and the foliage a little bit through it. In this case, we can clearly make out that someone fell on the floor, and that maybe number 6 or number 8 is walking in the distance over there. So aperture is probably going to be closer to that 5, maybe at the most 11, where it's kind of blurred out but still pretty prominent. But given how much blur is there, and the fact that you can't read the top of that helmet or what the symbols are on the thigh pads that he's got going on, I probably would say this is closer to a 5, maybe a 6, at the highest 11. I have one more. This is like a bad photo to me, and I like having this one in here. But basically, this kind of shows two different things. So number one, this is a long exposure photo. The reason I know it's a long exposure is you have these red lights that are whisking across on the bottom there, and that's all coming from motion. So this is what I've determined is either a train stop or some sort of car highway where they're going through in Europe over there. From there, though, we have a very high ISO, and we can see pixelation in areas like the spokes. We can see pixelation in darker areas like the sky by the buildings over there. So between having a high ISO and long exposure, we're getting this really ugly light flare that comes off that makes all of these street lamps look like they're exploding stars. On top of that, too, we have a pretty wide open aperture. So the aperture is probably going to be something closer to a 22 or 16, maybe a little lower than that, because we can see the buildings in perfect detail, bike in perfect detail. Not a lot is spatially blurred out. So background and foreground relationship are flat on top of each other. Add in that you have a higher ISO, probably something closer to 1,000, maybe 1,200, and on top of that you're doing long exposure. You're just oversaturating the camera, giving it too much light that's coming in, giving it that blur on the background itself, while then keeping to a very flat image with these harsh lights on there. So an example of what not to do. So one of the things I like to say, learning your camera is only the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. Take it with you. If you're going on vacation, the other day I just went to the grocery store. I forgot I had this with me in the car, and I was like, I'm gonna bring it in. And I just started taking pictures of boxes, placement of products everywhere. It helps me become more familiar with my camera, helps me practice different settings on the camera. But it's one of those things that because it's in my hand all the time, I'm more comfortable with using it even when I don't pick it up for a couple weeks. Photography is one of those forms of art where if you keep practicing and learning it, that's great. But if you stop doing stuff for a little bit of time and you just put it away because you have other hobbies, then it fades to the background, and before you know it, you forgot all the little basic tips and tricks that you learned. So practice with it. Take it with you. Use the camera. If you go on vacation and you don't bring the camera, I think that's a shame on you. You definitely should have it with you. So practice, take it out with you everywhere you go. Go to classes. My classes are obviously free. You guys can always come to more of these. You can come when I'm working and ask me questions on the floor. But almost every local community college throughout the city and the suburbs have not a free class, but a non-accredited class where you don't get credits towards a college degree, but you'll get professors and people who are photographers who are super knowledgeable on the subject. They'll walk you through the basics of just saving files. They'll give you more one-on-one lessons, but they'll also just help you set up still lifes and take pictures of boring things, but they'll help you work on those finer details of shooting. YouTube is probably one of the best resources out there for photographers, that and Instagram nowadays. I tell people all the time that if there's a picture or something that you like, maybe an artist who does something a specific way, look up how that is done, and you'll have 1,000 different videos of photographers, videographers who try to break down every little detail that someone does and copy them to a T. A joke in the artist world is that copying someone is one of the highest forms of flattery that you can give them. No artist just comes out of nowhere and has these great ideas. Everybody steals ideas from everybody, and then from there they manipulate them and find their own kind of pathway in there. So find artists, find people that you like on YouTube, watch their material, watch what they have to say, set your camera up that same way, and then make the judgment for yourself whether you like that feature or don't like that feature. Maybe you change certain aspects on there. those really help and go a long way. Workshops are great too. I have a couple different crews that come through here. One is the club that shoots out of the Chicago Botanic Gardens. They're a workshop club. They take pictures. They basically then compete with each other and see who has the better picture. Then I have another group that shoots over at the O'Hare. They have a special little area on the tarmac they can stand, and they can take pictures of people landing and coming down. It's really awesome what they get. But they work together. They communicate with each other. They all use different equipment, but since they're photographing the same subject, and because it's the same features like f-stop, shutter speed, aperture, f-stop, shutter speed, ISO, it's a universal language that doesn't matter if you have a Sony or a Leica or a Canon or a Nikon or any of the other brands that exist. As long as you understand what those are, you can work with other people, communicate, and figure it out. And then obviously travel. I already said that enough. If you leave the state, if you go visit grandma and grandpa and they live 8 miles away, bring the camera with you. Take it with you. My recommended accessories, and I usually always do this with my hand when I do this, really you should just, if you're on a budget and you're not concerned or worried about it, get the top 4. You should always have a bag for safe travels to take this thing around with you. When I travel with just my one camera with me, I usually just keep it together and it's always around my neck. So it's not necessarily it's not necessary that you have to bring your bag everywhere you go, but if you're getting on an airplane, getting in a car, you're going for a distance, have the camera in a bag, safe and sound, so it doesn't break. You're putting a lot of money into this stuff. Don't damage it. An extra battery and a memory card, I think, are foundational. I always tell the horror story of, I had an event that I had to go shoot at. Not only was my battery not charged for the event, which I thought I charged the night before, on top of that, both of my memory cards that were inside my camera decided to go kaput on me and neither wanted to load, so even when I did get the camera charged up and ready to go, I didn't have anywhere to store photos and take pictures, so it literally was a wash for me. I couldn't do my job that I was getting paid for that day, which really sucked. Have extra batteries, have extra memory cards, get a bag big enough to store that kind of stuff in there. I usually travel anywhere with 2 extra batteries and maybe 5 or 6 extra memory cards in a container. That might be a little overkill, but if you have at least 1 extra battery and 1 extra memory card, you've at least got yourself in a good position if something does go wrong. Have a lens cleaning kit. Never use your t-shirts or your sweaters or your pants to scrub the lens. The joke in the camera world, which I think is on another slide that I call out, is marry your lenses, date your body. The camera body will go bad, but if you take really great care of those lenses, they should transfer over to newer bodies and newer cameras as you keep advancing yourself. So get a cleaning kit with a microfiber cloth to scrub that lens and make sure things are clean. And then a strap. It's really nice to have on the camera. It takes the weight off of you having to hold it in your hands. Also, keeping it around your neck gives you the ability to take pictures at all times, which I think is really useful. Tripods are great if you want extra stabilization. Definitely look into that. It is a little bulkier, so you got to carry that around. External hard drives are awesome if you don't like using cloud-based solutions like a Google Drive or Amazon Photos. A really nice thing to do is keep a hard drive with you, plug that into the laptop, and you can download everything from there. Polarizing filters and D-filters. As you get better at taking photos, you might notice that water or metal or snow or just the environments that you're in create nasty glares or bad features on your photos. From that, I will then get a filter to put on there that should help cut down on that. If you've ever had a polarized pair of sunglasses, driving with a polarized pair versus not driving with a polarized pair makes a big difference. That's how your camera perceives things too. So by putting that little filter on there that costs $30–50, it can really make a big difference when you have bright and sunny pictures. And then additional lenses, which is what we're going to really break into now, of what lenses are available, what you need, and what's out there. Date your body, marry your glass. This is an age-old camera expression. Eventually, you give your camera body a good 10 years of on and off use, and it's basically useless. It won't work the way it did when you first got it. Features aren't the same that they used to be. The camera advancements at this point have come a long way. It's similar in like the phone world. If you buy a cell phone, it's usually every 5 or 6 years you upgrade your phone. You'll notice that there's big differences. In the world of cameras, I'd say a good 10 years, and then there are some new advancements or shifts in the technology that are definitely worth looking into if you're serious about it. The glass, the lenses, though those are going to continue over. So even if you have an older Nikon series, it moves to the new Nikon with an adapter. Canon, same thing. They have adapters that then bring everything over. So you're not stuck with whatever you buy. If you make big investments into it, they will transfer over. Now, focal length and zoom, we're going to put those in the same category. When scientists were inventing lenses and figuring out ways to call out the numbers, I don't fully understand. There's a few different stories, but they went with the millimeter size. That does not mean that your camera is only zooming, 400 millimeters or 70 millimeters. It's not that small of an amount, no. But it's their way of capturing and telling you exactly what you're doing when you're zooming in. And as a photographer, the more you play with the lenses in your cameras, the more these numbers start to make sense. But the way that zoom works on a camera is not only are you bringing in your subject matter, you're bringing in an entire section or chunk of the image. So when we zoom at a 70 millimeter, we have a pretty wide angle shot where we have a swamp, we have water, we have this greenery in the background, and what seems to be a city and mountains. As we move up to 105, we're now bringing that stuff closer. We're trimming off the excess edges. We're bringing the clouds closer in on us there too. But now that marshy swamp area is closer, the birds are closer, and so is our mountain range and our forest or shrubbery area. 200 does the same thing. In this case, we're starting to cut the sky out now, and those mountains feel like they've come up a great distance above our city, bigger than they were on the other two images. But at the same time, our city has gotten closer and bigger, the greenery has gotten closer and more defined, and then our birds as well are in the same boat. And then when we double that and we go all the way up to 400, now we can't even see the top of the mountains anymore. We are now on top of the mountains there. Our buildings are in the foreground or are in the background, but we can see more of that now in the detail. Same thing with the trees and the shrubbery in the back, but the birds, our main point of subject matter, are now closer. So focal length and zoom are not only going to just affect whatever you're pointing the lens at, they're going to affect the entirety of the frame. You're about to bring everything closer in. So that's where having the closer zooms are great when you have a nice aperture to blur things out in the background, especially if you're not concerned about the background. Your main focus is just the pelicans as they play in the water there. Focal length, though, also equates to compression. So not only are we pulling things forward when we zoom in, but when we zoom out, we start to compress our background and we get a more narrow or a fattening effect. And I use this one as a nice example because it shows the portraits. When we get to 16, which is one of the lowest numbers on there, the nose of this gentleman comes more forward, the glasses get a little bit more chunky as well, but the face itself becomes extremely narrow and pointy. Versus when we get down to 200, the cheeks fill out, the glasses go back into a normal size where they're not bulky anymore, but then the head looks in a sense more normal. On top of that, when we're at 16, we can see almost all of the white background of the sky, the tree is lost behind him, but then as we zoom inwards, everything comes forward as this then decompresses. So not only are we going to be bringing in both the background and the foreground on this, but by changing the lens that we have, we're also going to have more compression within this. Our subject matter is not moving. He's staying in the same spot this entire time. What we're doing is changing the lens, whether this be an all-in-one lens that gets us the lowest 16 and then brings us to 200, which is probably more likely the case, or if we then have multiple lenses that we're putting on here, keeping our subject matter in the same place, this effect is going to happen no matter what we do. So keep in mind that when we're using lenses, focal length is going to equate to zoom, but that zoom is going to come with a price, and that price being compression. And we just have to find a way to play with that, whether or not we blur the background out to not focus in on that, or whether then we change the parameter of what the photo is up, meaning the composition, in order to get something that doesn't show off so much compression.
Wouldn't you typically have the subject farther away?
You can, and that would be. And that would
You
probably be more
using
appropriate.
a higher millimeter and
Yeah.
zooming in.
Yeah. For this point though, that's not going to show off compression.
No, right, but okay.
So yeah, in that
I'm
case,
just surprised that even in 200 millimeters, you would be just getting his nose.
yeah.
No, like, that would be the only thing that you'd be getting surprised you can still get his face zooming in that much.
Yeah. It's all based on how you're using that lens and then exactly how you're positioning that. So in this case, however the photographer is doing this, they are most likely positioning the lens in a different category while not moving their subject matter, so that way they can convey the difference between the foreground and the background. So at 200 millimeters, they're probably backing up a little bit more in order to do that, if that makes sense. They're not moving the subject matter, but the photographer themselves
Oh,
is
you
changing
think so?
their difference. I would imagine so.
Yeah, okay.
Because if you're doing 200 and you're right up on his face, that's not going to give you that background effect. If anything,
Right.
you'd be zooming right into the nose.
Right. Yeah, okay. Interesting.
So common lenses, the lenses, if you were to go out right now onto the floor and take a look at what we have available, these are the typical lenses you'll see. Then I'm going to tell you the lenses that you need. Common lenses, we'll start with the kit lens. So like exactly what you would have gotten with your Nikon. Typically you're getting your average run-of-the-mill lens. It's a standard kind of way to get started with everything. In this case, they give you something that's more all-encompassing, so 18 to 55. That's a good wide-angle portrait. Lower the number, the wider depth or field of view we're going to have. The bigger the number, the more precise and the more zoomed in we're going to get with it. When you're at that 50 to 75 to 85 range on a lens for the millimeter size, that's considered your perfect portrait area. That's perfect for taking a portrait picture, blurring out parts of the background, or that compression that we're talking about as well, where you bring things forward or bring things back. In this case, they give you one that does both, so that way you can have the best of both worlds with this. When you're looking then to set the aperture on this, like what we were just discovering there, at a 18, your lowest number is 3.5. That's the best aperture you can get, so not really a full background blur, but you'll be able to basically mute a lot of the stuff that's behind it. As you zoom into that 5.6 number, now you're going, or as you start zooming towards 55, I should say, you're going to be getting closer to 5.6. 5.6 is going to blur the background out even less, but because we have a kit lens to keep the cost and the materials down on this, this is their way of giving you a lens that hits a bunch of different numbers, but doesn't necessarily give you a powerful aperture to accomplish things like perfect portrait or background blur. In that case, we could then upgrade our lens and go into something a little bit more advanced. But for starting purposes, this is usually more than enough to get people off the ground so they know what they're doing. The next thing that comes up is what you call a nifty 50 or a prime lens. Now, nifty 50s, if you think about it, the human eye naturally sees in a 50 millimeter style. Our human eye is the equivalent to a 50 millimeter lens. A prime lens is going to be a single lens or a single digited lens. So in this case, a 50 millimeter, because it can't zoom, that 50 doesn't become a 200, nor does it become an 18. It's always going to be a 50. So we consider that a prime lens. Prime lenses are fantastic because they are going to give you a much, much lower maximum aperture number. So in this case, where the kit lens could only do a 3.5 or a 5.6, we can see that clearly written out on the side there. Our prime lens is going to give us a 1.4 in this case. We can see that written from the top right here. That 1.4 is going to give us significant background blur. It's going to give us more of that bokeh effect if that's something that we want. And when it comes to portraits or just disturbing or getting rid of the background on there, this is going to be one of the better lenses to do that sort of thing. We'll see that if we look at an 85 or a 35 millimeter lens or a 105 lens or a 200 millimeter lens. If it's a single number and it can't be zoomed in or out, it's a prime lens. And typically prime lenses will offer us a much lower maximum aperture because there is no zoom technology built into it, just a focusing meter. On the flip side of that, we have a telephoto lens. Telephoto is similar to telescope or telescopic. What we're getting with that is a variable lens that could shift. This is very similar to a kit lens. But where this differs from a kit lens is that usually the aperture on this one, when you're buying more of a high-end telephoto or zoom lens, is going to be 2.8 being the lowest that you can go. If you buy a zoom lens and you buy one of the higher quality ones, for example, Canon marks their high quality glass with a red line that goes across it. That's their L series glass. For Sony, they mark it with an orange G on there, and that's their G Master, but that's going to be their best version of a G Master. There's also the silver G Master, and there's Zeiss lenses, so on and so forth. And Nikon uses Nikkor glass, or just their standard glass. If you're buying Nikkor glass, you're buying their top of the line. And really what top of the line is going to do is, number one, it's going to be heavier. Be aware of that right off the bat. If you want perfect quality and the better quality lenses, they're going to weigh a significant amount more. But because they weigh more, they have more glass on the inside. That glass is going to give you a better focusing ability, where if you're just focusing in on one subject and now you want to eliminate background, you're going to have a much easier ability to do that. As well too, with something like this Canon lens, if I zoom from 24 to 70, it's going to keep a continuous 2.8 the whole time. It's not going to fluctuate from 2.8 to 5.6 because I go up in the number. That's another feature that you're paying for when you buy the higher end or higher quality glass. The other big difference between the two, and I don't think that the next slide, it does. So prime versus zoom. Prime lens, you get a much lower maximum aperture, so something like a 1.4, 1.8. With a prime lens, it's one singular number. There's no zooming. So what I warn people about with this one is that if I'm taking a picture of something, and for example, I have a 35mm prime lens on here with a maximum of 2 for my aperture. If I'm taking a picture over here and I don't like what it looks like, I don't get to zoom in and out. I now have to physically move closer or move further away or change my angle in order to get the shot that I want. Whereas with a zoom lens, I might not necessarily have a low aperture like a 2 or a 2.8. Maybe I have a kit lens that zooms, or maybe I did spend the money and buy the higher quality glass and I can get down to a 2.8. Now, if let's say I don't like the composition that I'm getting, rather than have to move my whole body, I can simply zoom in or out in order to change the frame that I see. So that's another advantage versus the zoom lens. So again, movement, not moving, having better background and foreground relationship versus a little less of that. Both are perfect in their own situations, and that's the key that I say to most people is when they ask what do I recommend. Personally, I'm a prime lens fan because I can get a really low aperture and take really sharp, crystal clear pictures. But I like zoom lenses, especially when I'm maybe doing things like architecture. Every summer I try to go on a Chicago boat tour where we go downtown and ride around the river. I like having a zoom lens because I'll see a building in the distance where I just want to get the top of the building. I can zoom in and do that. But then I can get a little wider with it and get a really nice shot of 5 or 6 buildings next to each other, or a really nice shot going down the river where you get a clear view. It's different for everybody and what they're trying to accomplish with them, but that's the big difference that you're going to see between the two. The last lens that you'll see out there is the travel lens. I don't really recommend it as much, but I get a lot of people that want to go on vacation or safari. They don't want to have multiple lenses that they're carrying with them. They also don't want to buy a brand new camera that then does all this extra features. So what they'll do is they'll buy a travel lens. Travel lens is typically going to have a really low number to a really high number as far as the zoom is concerned. In this case, you have an 18 to 135. But where you have an 18 to 135, your aperture is also going to be a maximum of 3.5 to 5.6. So you're not going to get a lot of background blur. You're not going to be able to let in the most amount of light. So this lens is really meant to be a situational lens depending on what you're trying to do. Most people that I sell these lenses to are going on cruises or safaris or things where there's a lot of light or a lot of sun hitting them, and they know they're going to be at extreme distances from whatever they're taking pictures of. So a travel lens would probably be appropriate for those types of situations. Now, I put quotations around need for what lenses do you need. That's because in reality, you don't need any of these lenses, but people want to be specific with it. So what I always tell them is that there is a trinity of lenses. The 50mm prime should be your probably most important or well used. Now, if a 50 isn't what you want, 35 is fantastic. That's what I have on my Leica. A 75 or an 85 is fantastic lenses too, because those are going to be prime portrait lenses. But you want some form of prime lens to get the best aperture possible. So that way, if you do want to take portraits or pictures of people specifically, and you really want to get the detail, blur things out, you're going to get that with this. A 24 to 70 would be my next most essential lens. 24 to 70 is basically going to be your middle ground. That gives you your wide angle to more portrait. If you get a nice high-end glass on there too, you can get some really nice portrait style pictures, and possibly that 50 millimeter might not make sense for you then, and the 24 to 70 might be your most well used. One of my other cameras that I have, my Fujifilm, I really only use an 18 to 55 on there with a 2.8 f-stop, and I don't use any of my other lenses for that camera. That one solves all my problems that I need. But then on top of that, if let's say you are going out on safaris or trips, or you just are an avid birder or hiker or whatever have you with nature life, something with big zoom might be really important too. You see the bird in the distance, the 24 to 70 is not going to give you that, the 50 is not going to give you that, but that 70 to 200 is. It's a big, big lens. It's going to be a heavy lens to have on there. It's probably not going to be your most primary used lens, but in situations where you need distance, that's where that usually is going to be the best. If I get someone who comes in and they're like, I only have money for 2 lenses, or they only want to bring 2 lenses with them, I typically will say go with the 50 and the 24 to 70. Most people think they need a zoom, and they really don't need a zoom, but everybody's different on what they're taking photos of. So the first thing I always tell people is stick with the kit, buy your kit lens, buy that stuff, because not only is it going to give you a nice introduction into the product, before you start investing serious money into this stuff, you can just really make sure that this is something that you want to do because of how, not complicated, but how many steps or features or everything else is involved with these lenses. And that is all I have. This is the longer class that I have, so we just went past everything. I'm obviously going to be here for questions, but next week is going to be the 3rd week of the month, or 3rd Thursday of the month, so we are going to do advanced cameras. That's where we talk about photo editing. So we're going to talk about things like saturation, hue. We're going to talk about, I'm slipping. We're going to talk about all the features that you'll see on something like an Adobe Lightroom or Photoshop or Corel Paint Shop or any of those methods of editing your photos, and basically what you do after you've taken and captured your images. From there too, we'll talk about content creation and getting into that a little bit more. And yeah, that's all I got for you. If you've got any questions that you don't want to ask me now and you want to ask later, my email and phone number are up there. Call or contact me anytime. I'm here every day except for Tuesday, Wednesday, so I'll be here for the rest of the weekend. Other than that, what kind of questions do you have for me now? If anybody has anything. If you don't, not a big deal. I'll open the doors that way, you guys can feel free to go. But if you got any questions, please stop me. I'll answer them for you.
Do you always shoot in like full manual?
No, I typically will shoot in aperture priority. That's been my personal favorite.
And the ISO just does it automatically, and the shutter speed automatically.
Unless I'm doing stuff where I know that there's going to be heavy action. So like for example, I'm a big soccer guy, I like going to soccer games. When I bring my camera to those, I will actually then change the shutter speed, because where I'm sitting, I'll have a good example of seeing the pitch.
Right.
If I see someone's loading up, first thing I'll do is switch to a burst mode, where it's like what you hear when you're like at a football game where it's
Yeah.
I'll switch to burst, and then on top of that, I'll then drop my shutter speed to like 1,000. That should then give it where it's closing and opening at a fast rate, but then I'm also getting multiple images by just holding the trigger down one time. Hopefully in that period of time, if the guy's coming through and then kicking the ball, I'm going to get one image where the leg is in perfect focus, the ball's in perfect focus, and there's not a lot of motion on the body.
So you end up with like too many pictures often?
Usually when I shoot, if I go on vacation, I come back with about 10 to 15,000 photos. So then I go through, I edit all those down, I delete, I'd say probably 14,000 of those, 13,000 of them.
Most of all.
Yeah, exactly. So, Usually on a typical vacation, I was in London for 2 weeks. I probably came back with about 20,000 photos. I kept maybe 3,000.
How many SD cards did you?
Usually with me, it depends. I sometimes will also carry a hard drive with me, but in my bag when I'm traveling, there's about 6 or 7 SD cards that I have. I back them up to a hard drive after I'm done for the day, and then if the SD card fills out, just so I have multiple sources of the photos, I'll put that in the case, won't delete or erase anything, just put a new one on.
Do you shoot in RAW?
Not often. I'm not a big photo editor. Between my Leica, my Fujifilm, and my Sony, they have really good natural color. Great seeing you. They have great natural color that I personally don't want to edit them. When I do professional work for like my different charity events that I'm involved in, I will edit those photos because they are looking for something a little bit more together. So
Sure.
it just depends on the situation that I'm in.
Quick question with regards to geotags.
Okay.
When I transferred my phone, the geotag doesn't transfer.
Not even when you go into the meta information of the photo and you look at the settings and the information?
No.
You have a laptop you can bring in? I would say bring that in. We can take a look and see why that's not transferring. It could be a setting that's on the physical camera. It also could be something with the SD card.
Thank you
Okay.
so much.
It was actually to my iPhone rather than to a laptop.
Oh, that would make sense. There's probably information that's not coming off on the phone. I typically don't recommend transferring from the camera to the phone because there's stuff that doesn't come through and there's stuff that does. But typically if you're transferring from the camera to the computer, you should get all the geotags and location from there. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'll have to bring it in and we can have a...
Yeah, bring the laptop in, bring that all this stuff, and then we can play with it as well too. But it also depends on the camera, as long as firmware updates are all up to date, and then there are some settings on there that we can look at. But typically, from my experience, going from phone to or camera to phone, there's a lot of stuff that you'll miss on there. I usually only recommend it if, let's say, there's 10 or 15 photos that you're like, okay, I want to send these to my wife or my kids to show them my vacation I'm doing. Then do it that way. The picture quality is going to be diminished on there. It's not going to look as appropriate as with the computer. And then information like the geotag or the RGB or the histogram that's on there too, a lot of that stuff gets lost in the transfer.
Okay. I'm off to Antarctica. Any special things I should...
I would say a couple things you could play with when you leave for Antarctica.
Next Thursday.
I would say look at, so if you see wildlife, I definitely would switch to burst photography. So do the drive mode, go from single shot to burst. I would look at your white balance on there. Sony does this really neat thing that most camera companies don't do. If you remove that body cap that's from your camera and you lay that down on a flat surface, take your camera and basically take a picture of that cap. What's going to happen is it's going to adjust the white balance of your camera. So when you get to where you're going, imagine a cruise. When you get to closer to that area, take that outside, put the cap on a table of some sort, and then take a picture of that cap. From there, the camera itself is going to adjust itself for the white balance, so that way when you do get those blue, white, and kind of more, there's one more color that's in that spectrum when you're in an area like Antarctica, that'll all be more apparent on the physical balance of it. So the white balance is super important when taking pictures of the snow, glaciers, water, because all of that is going to have a natural hue that your camera's been picking up as you've been shooting in other locations. So you want to make sure you fine-tune it just for that. So there's a setting in the camera that can change auto white balance to whatever you want it to be, but then Sony makes it really easy where you take a picture of that cap, and then it automatically changes the white balance for you. So that would be the things I would look at, would be your white balance, and then I really would just be the white balance on there. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I would play with. Aperture priority is probably going to be more of your better friend with that one. Shutter speed probably doesn't matter too much unless you see wildlife, or unless you get that really cool thing where the glaciers start to break apart and drop in. Then you probably want to use shutter with the burst on there too.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course, anytime.
So if I put a ISO auto
Okay.
with the flash,
Okay.
it's only forward.
Okay.
I don't know.
Did you try to switch it from auto to something else?
Yeah, I put the auto. Yeah, right.
Okay. Well, take it off auto and see. Can you then raise your ISO higher?
ISO.
Yeah. So you're on auto.
Yeah, auto. Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, do you want your ISO to be higher? Is that what you're asking?
No, yeah, I put auto mode, see that now it's a dark area.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
only 400.
No, no, I understand, but if you want it to be, do you want it to be higher? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Well, then take it off auto and then make it higher.
Doesn't work.
It should.
Yeah, if I put
So then here, go from auto, and then you can then start going. So now you can go
no,
even
no,
higher.
I'm not the camera pick up exactly how many, 200 or 300. If you put indoor, I go with the bright area,
Okay.
400. The dark area, 400.
Well, then you
What's
can-
the meaning of the auto?
But then you can raise it then in the dark area. You can switch it from 400.
That's meaning manual, right?
Yeah, but that's going to be because you have a DSLR with a flash on there and you're letting your camera go auto. So the camera isn't necessarily going to say that it
okay,
needs to
that's
go
why I-
higher.
yeah.
That's where you need to be manually controlling that
That's
stuff.
why I'm doing the manual.
Yeah.
Auto is outdoor, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So indoor doesn't work.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, with a flash, it's not going to do that. Yeah.
Oh.
No, that makes sense with
If
a
I
flash.
if it not flash,
It should. It
It's
should
a
be
lot of
able to.
noise.
But the other thing too is that I mean it is a DSLR, so
Yeah,
it's
it
not
is.
going to do well for low light photography. It's going to rely on things like the flash to do better for
So
it.
mirrorless, okay.
Mirrorless is going to be much better for
But
that kind of stuff.
Nikon 6, okay.
Yeah, but Nikon. I would-
Z6.
Z6 is great. I probably would tell you to stick with Canon though, because the new menu systems can be confusing. The menu system on the Canon series, the R series, would be very similar to what you already know. You wouldn't have to relearn the camera, and you've got the really nice glass. You have the 24 to 70. You can move that over to the new body without having to buy new lenses or any of that stuff.
Oh.
So that's probably a better idea. I would definitely look at the Canons.
Yeah. If the lens calibration or the cleaning the camera,
Mm-hmm.
which one is better? Sim? If I
For,
put
like a lens cleaning kit, is that what you're asking? Or?
the calibration, lens calibration.
I mean, you can. I usually calibrate at the body itself, but I keep the lens that I'm using on there. But it's very rare that I calibrate. I rarely do anything like that with
Yeah.
my
If I
cameras.
focus sometime, I focus subject to you, right?
Mhm.
I focus. Maybe the bike is sharp.
Well, then that's based on your aperture. Then, and that should be where you're changing the aperture priority and the focus parameter on there to make sure that you're focusing it on me. That just is a misfire. Then, if you're going, that doesn't really have anything to do with the calibration, because the calibration is going to focus on the color of the lens.
Yeah, I shoot to one shot.
Okay.
Yeah. If I put the focus, sometime in the past, maybe the guy the
Yeah,
sharp.
and that's your focus on there. You just need to
Is
sharpen
there
up the
any
focus.
setting problem?
No, it wouldn't be a setting it on there. It's you. It's the focus. You gotta then just
Oh.
change the focus up.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Why outside? If I put air mode, aperture mode,
Mhm.
so a lot of people blue feature. I take it, everything. Then the subject is dark.
So
it's bigger in the sky, everything okay.
Probably because you're using a higher aperture. When you're at something like
No, I put
What kind of-
200.
what's your aperture though?
Aperture is maybe 6, 7. F point.
Well, in that case, then you probably want to either make the shutter speed slower so that more light can come in.
No. Shutter speed I put maybe 200, 300.
Okay.
F point I make 8.
Okay.
Then I put out the sunny light.
Sure.
So shoot subject dark.
Then I would take a look at your exposure compensation. So the things that we were talking about at the very end. This.
I do exposure compensation 0.
Okay.
And I can shoot.
Yeah.
Same.
But then I would raise your exposure compensation. So if your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture are where they need to be.
if I put higher, the subject very, it's not looking good. It's too much light.
Okay. Well, then that's
In
where
the behind the sky.
yeah.
But,
I understand what you're saying. So then I would play with your exposure.
Yeah,
And
I
your
do.
exposure will make it lighter or darker. And if that's still not working, then you have to readjust your ISO, readjust your shutter.
If
and you
it,
gotta
if
keep
it, if it
manipulating.
comes the sun coming straight to the face,
Yeah.
I shoot in the dark.
I know, that's what I'm saying. Exposure. You gotta then
Yeah.
play with this.
Yeah, I focus on the exposure and the
What I would-
zero.
Then you don't, but you don't want these to be zero. You want to raise these.
Oh.
Yeah, no, you don't want them to be zero then. If it's
If you put
If it's
go
still-
down, maybe too dark.
exactly, so then go up to make it lighter.
But if you go up, I put in the computer the picture is not good.
Well, then you just have to keep working with it until you get it. It's all touch and feel. You gotta just keep doing it until it gets right. Otherwise, then you gotta change your shutter, change your aperture, or change your ISO again, and get that at a different number.
Oh.
Yeah. So that's you just gotta keep manipulating until you hit it.
Yeah. If you look, if you go F4, you go down, maybe the right side is not sharp. Only the middle.
Okay. How long have you had the camera too?
Yeah.
How long have you had the camera for?
This one I had 2 years.
Okay. So only 2 years. I mean, it probably is just the settings on there. You're not setting this stuff properly.
Oh.
What I would say is next time you get those types of photos, let me see them, and then we can take a look and see what the settings you're using on there, and I can show you maybe to raise or change something up, because it tells you when you hit the info button on all your photos what settings were used. So then from there you can double check and see if you need to raise or lower.
Yeah, if I put Adobe editing, that's not good. I put everything exactly.
Okay.
Then I try to manual, I put the aperture model, 62, then I put it within the, some part it's very dark, some is dark.
It's just practice. You got to keep practicing with it, and you probably just don't have full control over it yet.
The people go wrong,
Yeah.
the sunlight goes over here, no light inside.
So then, I would say if you've set your numbers to everything and it's where it's at, play with this. And if it still is too dark, then you need to set the other stuff in the camera and
So
reset.
that's the situation you can put the flash of it.
It depends. I mean, it should help with that, but it might put too much light on the subject. Whereas just playing with exposure might be enough. But yeah, a flash would be fine too. That would help.
Yeah, put the auto mode, right?
Yeah.
TTL.
You can do the TTL on there one, or I might
if you
control it.
override, it can go down, right?
Yeah, but I mean, if you're doing full manual on the camera, you probably want to do full manual control on your flash too.
Oh, the manual?
Yeah, you want to do the full. So that way you control the speed. So whatever your shutter speed on your camera is, then you set the speed on the flash itself.
So you can put manual, you can.
Yep, you can either do TTL or manual.
Manual, you get a high power or slow start?
You can do it as fast or as slow as you want it to be.
Oh.
You set it based on your camera settings.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
So let's test it, right?
Yeah, test it, take a look at the stuff, and then again, bring images in, and we can take a look and see exactly why they don't look right on the camera. The camera gives all that information.
Hello. So we got a question.
Sure.
This camera can connect to the computer too.
Yeah.
We don't know how to.
So you just gotta plug it in.
So you got a plug it in?
Yeah, so it's not going to go digitally. So the only thing this will communicate with is your cell phone. You can download an app on the phone and transfer images.
Okay.
But then when you get home, you just go on the side of the camera here.
There's Apple computer. It's Apple computer.
Yeah, totally works for an Apple computer. You can plug in right there. Yeah, it's that top one right there. It's a micro USB. It's your charging cable. The other thing that you should do, and what I would recommend, is to physically take this card out and then put this into the computer. That's how you should be doing it. You get the adapter.
Adapter?
Yeah, it's like $29.
Oh, okay.
And that plugs right in, and then that gets all the information over. That's the best way.
We don't know.
Yeah.
Because we try to do it for the phone and we don't get all everything. So
Yeah. I would definitely get the adapter. If you talk to anybody who either works in the Apple section or the people by the fish tank there, they can sell you one. But then that plugs into the computer. The SD card plugs into that, and then from there you can transfer all the images over, and it's that easy.
Okay, one question, this is mine. And how can I transfer the camera for the picture for my phone?
You gotta download the app. So if you go home, the easiest thing to do would be to look this camera up. Type in Canon 90D, Canon EOS 90D, how to transfer from camera to cell phone. They'll tell you
I
the
don't
app.
want transfer on, I want.
Yeah. It'll tell you exactly what to do, because what happens is once you've downloaded the app and you've connected the phone to the camera, you can then go through and select which photos you want and transfer only those photos to the phone. The rest then stay on the camera. You can then put it into the computer, delete what you want, get rid of anything else that you want to get rid of.
because we got two cameras. The other one is my daughter camera. With the other one, you just press a little button right here
Yeah,
and search the phone and get it. With this one,
it's more complicated.
it's complicated.
Because it's a slightly higher end camera. The other one makes it really simple to
I
transfer.
know, that's the reason why we got the camera.
But they say when I bought this last year,
Mhm.
and they say this is stable, the pictures.
Yeah.
This is what they are is.
Yeah.
Okay, so your classes start, because I know, I
Yeah.
saw that
So
they
we
start.
did the beginner class last week. That was the first Thursday of the month. Today was the intermediate. Next Thursday is going to be the advanced, and then we have a break for 1 week, and then the last Thursday of the month, on February 29th, we'll have Beyond the Traditional Camera, which is really not focusing on this. It focuses on drones, GoPros, camcorders, so you probably don't need to come for that. But I would say, bring your lenses in, bring this stuff in, come in on a day when I'm here. I'm only off
Yeah,
on
we
Tuesday,
forgot
Wednesday.
to do
Yeah,
that.
because we don't think, the reason was there was missing communication.
Yeah.
That's one called and they say the class today. I called yesterday, they told me no, the class is next month. So I said, okay.
We just start coming to see if it was a
We do,
class.
yeah, we do them every Thursday at 5:30 to 7. We do the first, the second, and then the third and the last Thursday of every month. So there's 5 Thursdays this month, so we're just gonna skip one of those Thursdays. But we do it every week. So yeah, please
We'll see you next week.
bring the lens, bring anything else with you too, and then we can do more questions. If you have a laptop too, bring the laptop. I'll show you how to move everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course, folks. Take care.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Thanks for coming in. All right. Everybody online, thanks for watching. Thanks for being here. My name is Saxon. I teach the camera classes here. Let me switch this guy over. If anybody has any comments, questions, or concerns, email me, call me. You've got my information. I will be here next week for the advanced camera class, and then after that we'll have 1 week break. We'll go into the last beyond your traditional camera class, where we'll break down things like drones, GoPros, and all that other good stuff. So keep taking pictures, keep shooting. Email or text or email, call me if you guys have any questions. And as always,